Now we will hear from Professor Keith Vincent, Let Loose the Hungry Dogs. Natsume So again, as a post Russo Japanese War lecture.
Thank you, Grant, for making this happen. I've learned a lot today, and thank you everybody for the paper so far. I'd like to start reading you a little excerpt from the story I'm going to talk about today. It's called The Heredity of Taste. Under the influence of the weather, even the gods run mad. A voice came shouting from within the clouds, "Kill men, let loose the hungry dogs." The voice shook the Sea of Japan into turbulence and rang as far as the ends of Manchuria. In immediate response to that voice, the Japanese and the Russians between them created a massive slaughterhouse 200 miles long and 200 miles wide in the plains of northern Manchuria. Then from below the end of that almost endless plain, countless packs of ferocious hounds like four-legged bullets, all simultaneously discharged, came flying up to cut across and to slit lengthwise the wind that smelt of blood. Dancing with joy, some mad god cried, "Lap blood," and tongues of devouring flame lit up the dark earth, where one could hear the bubbling sound of thick blood being swallowed. That's the opening of Natsume So novella, The Heredity of Taste. And if you know Natsume So, you might be forgiven for not recognizing his style. This is not what we typically think of as So. We think of So as a writer who wrote books about family dynamics and domestic life of Japan's middle classes, about long simmering jealousies and love triangles, or about the anguish of male intellectuals. And yet it is So. It's the opening of one of the first books he wrote. It has the strange title of The Heredity of Taste, or Shumi no Iden. I'm curious, has anybody read it in this room? Yeah, it's definitely one of his lesser known works. Definitely one of his lesser known works, but I think a really key work to understand who So was as a writer. And I'm really grateful to have the opportunity to think about this novel in relation specifically to the Russo-Japanese War. I think it's an extraordinary text. I recommend that you all read it. As you can see, it is very much about the Russo-Japanese War. It is perhaps the most explicitly anti-war novel that So ever wrote. He wrote it in the first 2 weeks of December 1905, taking a break from I Am a Cat, his first ever novel, which I assume more of you have heard of, probably, Waga Hai wa Neko de Aru, which he had begun writing in January of that same year, 1905. That was his first novel. That novel also, we don't think of it that way, but it's very much inspired by the Russo-Japanese War. When the cat, for example, finally decides to go about catching mice, he calls himself Admiral Togo Heihachiro of the Cats, and he ponders how to inflict claw damage on the Russian horde. There's lots of references to the Nishio Senso in that book. Heredity of Taste is narrated by a scientist who speaks in the same pompous, know-it-all tone as Soseki's cat. It's interesting that the two books were translated by the same translator team, so they sound alike in English. But the story, such as it is simple. One day, the narrator finds himself in Shimbashi Station and is swept up in the crowd there to welcome back a general returning from Manchuria. The crowd yells, "Banzai," but the narrator finds the phrase sticks in his throat. Eventually, we learn that he's thinking of his close friend. He actually runs into a returned soldier who looks like his friend, and he's reminded of his friend, whom he calls Ko-san. This is a tall, good-looking, heroic type who perished in the Battle of Port Arthur. The story includes a graphic depiction of the way the imperial forces under General Nogi Marusuke sent thousands of soldiers to be mowed down by Russian fire until their bodies piled up to fill the trenches that the Russians had dug so that other soldiers could walk over them to their deaths. It's a powerful, gory, epic scene that portrays the senseless violence and mechanized death of modern warfare, certainly like nothing else Soseki ever wrote. I'll just read you an excerpt here. Here he's talking about his memories of his friend Ko-san. When one talks with Ko-san over a brazier, one's first impression is of sheer size. He's a big, fine-looking man, dark complexioned and with a thick beard. When he opens his mouth to tell an exciting story, his listeners have only room for Ko-san. Forgetting the things of today, the things of tomorrow, even about one's own enraptured self, nothing remains but Ko-san. Such incidents reveal his inner greatness, and I've always thought that wherever he goes, he's bound to attract attention. I'm thus reluctant in his connection to use a coarse word like wriggling, but it can't be helped. He's picturing him there in the battle, wriggling in the trench as he's dying. Like one of those ants seen wriggling on the blade edge of a hoe as it's wrenched up from the ground, so Ko-san wriggles. Like a baby spider swamped in a spoonful of water, Ko-san wriggles. In circumstances such as this attack, all individualities of men are simply blotted out. The huge mountain, the vast sky, the wintry wind that blows for 1,000 miles, the all-obliterating smoke, the shells flung roaring out from hundreds of cannon. Set beside these, not even a great man can be recognized as a great man. He becomes as individually meaningless as any single soybean in a big straw bag. Ah, Ko-san, where are you, and what are you doing? You ought quickly to become again your usual self, and so astound the Russians. The rest of the heredity of taste is quite complicated in a shaggy dog story kind of way. It's hard to summarize. The narrator runs into a woman when he visits Ko-san's grave, who he believes may have fallen in love with Ko-san, having seen him only once right before he left for the battlefield. And then the narrator develops a preposterous and strange theory that the affinity of these two young people for each other was actually inherited from their grandparents, whose planned marriage was prevented from happening by an arbitrary act of their domain lord. Their grandparents were in love with each other. The love never happened, and therefore when their grandchildren meet, they have inherited the taste of their grandparents and they fall in love at first sight, but nothing ever happens and he goes off to battle. Then the narrator ends up introducing the Ko-san's would-have-been widow to Ko-san's mother, and she's a great comfort to the motherless, and becomes like a daughter to her, even though they never got married. So in this sense, by imaginatively reconstructing this heredity of taste, this link to the past, in order to explain the present, the narrator attempts to use something like science, something like heredity, genetics, to repair a rift in his, to repair a rift, and somehow to mourn the loss of his friend Ko-san. It's really quite a kooky story. It swings wildly in tone from military epic, like I just read to you, to rakugo-like comedy, to scientific report. It also has pretty much all of the elements that Soseki would later go on to develop in his career as a writer. It's about grief and loss. It's about modernity and war. It does very interesting things with narration. Soseki famously started quite late as a writer. He was 38 years old when he published the first installment of I Am a Cat back in January of 1905. And a question that people often ask, I often ask about Soseki, is why did he start then? Why did he wait so long? What was it that inspired him to shift from his position as a scholar mostly to become a creative writer? Just briefly, I'll say I think there are two reasons for that. One has to do with the loss of his closest friend, the haiku poet Masaoka Shiki, who died in 1902 while Soseki was in England studying. And that's a loss that reverberates through everything he ever writes. So often, if you think about Soseki's work, they're often about someone who's died in the past and a person in the present who's still mourning that. So the most famous example of that is Kokoro, his great novel, where Sensei is grieving his friend Kei. And you notice that Kei also starts with a K, like Ko-san in this story. So that's one possible reason. Another reason, I think, has to do with the Russo-Japanese War. I think it is what he saw happening during and after the Russo-Japanese War, namely the transformation from what Soseki saw as a relatively healthy form of nationalism to a much more jingoistic, virulent, and imperial form of nationalism. And so with the help of this story, I'd like to talk today just a little bit about what we can see when how 1905 was for Soseki a kind of culmination of a process that began back in 1889. Back in 1889, when Soseki was 22. That was the year that Soseki first met his friend Shiki. That was the year they started to go see Rakugo together in January of 1889. That May, Shiki coughed up blood, and Soseki took care of him and comforted him, and they remained best friends, and also each other's most important reader and teacher for the rest of their lives. Also in 1889, the Meiji Constitution was promulgated. As everyone in this room knows, that was really the beginning of the end of any real democratic potential in modern Japanese history, the moment when the Meiji Genro state took control. So it's a very pivotal moment, right? On the same day as the Constitution was promulgated, February, I think it's 11th, a man named Kuga Katsunan founded the newspaper Nihon. It was founded to promote the national spirit, to strengthen national unity, but also, crucially, to oppose the new order that was put in place with the Meiji Constitution. It was shut down all the time by the government after that. In his editorials, Kuga argued for the adoption of European thought, but only on the foundation of Japanese culture. He opposed both blind rejection of Western ideas and mindless adoption of European practices. Nihon was also where Soseki's best friend Masaoka Shiki began working in 1892, and he worked there his whole life as a journalist. Kuga Katsunan was a friend of Shiki's uncle, and the two men were very close. He was also Shiki's next-door neighbor. So now back to the heredity of taste in 1905. I think this story can be read as a key text for understanding Soseki's view of nationalism and also what it was that spurred him into becoming a writer. He wrote it in 1905. This is the first year of his writing career, as I mentioned. In the first 2 weeks of December, that's just after martial law was lifted, after having been imposed to suppress the Hibiyo riots that were mentioned earlier today, that broke out after the signing of the treaty at Portsmouth. It's interesting to note that Soseki had a connection to Baron Komura Jutaro, one of the negotiators at Portsmouth. Komura was formerly an associate of Kuga Katsunan, the founder of Nihon, so he knew Shiki as well. It's interesting to think about what Soseki thought when he read of the negotiations at Portsmouth and saw Komura coming back to Tokyo to an infamously cold reception as he delivered the bad news about how much Japan had been cheated of from their perspective and what they thought they deserved. I think there's a really interesting contrast between Komura's reception and the hero's welcome given to the general that Soseki writes about. Probably it's General Nogi. 1889 was also the day, the first day, when Japanese chanted the phrase "banzai." We think of that as an ancient phrase, but actually it was a modern invention. This was on the occasion of the promulgation of the Constitution. Of course, people had said a version of that for centuries to praise the emperor, but they said banzai or mansai, one or the other. One is the kangon, the other is the goon. It was determined by Toyama Masakazu, who was a professor at Teidai at the time, that they needed a phrase that tripped off the tongue a little bit better and that you could yell better. So they took the ban from banzai and the sai from mansai, and they made a portmanteau word which was banzai. And the closest comparison I can think of is the word homosexuality in English, which is a strange, freakish combination of Latin and Greek that would never have been used in the ancient world, but is created in the modern world for a new need. So it was Toyama Masakazu who suggested it be pronounced banzai. They practiced it in the Faculty Assembly of Tokyo University on February 5th, and then on the day of the promulgation of the Constitution, at 1:15 p.m., when the Emperor and Empress left the palace in a carriage drawn by 6 horses, Toyama led 1,000 students of Teidai in chanting Ten no Heika Banzai. In Shumi no Iden, Soseki writes, "A battle cry says, 'Wah,' and in that 'wah' there is neither bad taste nor good sense, there is neither reality nor irreality, there is neither falsehood nor compromise, there is 'wah' and nothing else. Such crystallization of spirit, so totally exploded, sends shock waves out in all directions, waves with the sound of 'wah.' That sound is not demeaned with such meanings as can be found in banzai, help, or I'll kill you. 'Wah' is itself all spirit, it is soul, it is essential man, it is sincerity. I believe that not until one has attained the condition of being able to hear the ring of that sincerity can one truly feel sublimity in this, our human world. This is ironic, by the way, in case you're missing it. When one listens and is able simultaneously to hear the sincerity of several tens, several hundreds, several thousands, and several tens of thousands of people, then and only then can that feeling of sublimity rise to the supreme, stupendous level of heaven. Those strangely refreshing tears which I shed when I saw the general were, or so I fancy, my own poor body's reaction to the consciousness of heaven. But our narrator can't say Banzai. Soon thereafter, from the platform, maybe 150 yards away, comes a shout of Banzai. In deep successive waves of sound, the world roars ever nearer, drowning out the tail end of the starving man's remarks. Banzai! Bellowed everyone around me. Hardly had that greeting died away when a general, his right hand raised in a military salute, passed directly in front of me. He's a light-built man, deeply sunburnt, and sporting a grizzled beard. Banzai! Once again, the crowd around me shouted 10,000 years of honored memory onto the general's back. And so did I. Well, almost. In fact, though, I know it sounds odd, never till today has Banzai passed my lips. Not so far as I know that I was ever told not to shout it, nor do I hold as a matter of principle that so to shout is wrong. It simply is that in circumstances when I actually yearn to cry it aloud, nothing comes out, as though it were some pebble in my throat. Banzai jams in my windpipe, and try as I may, I cannot be dislodged. Though I strain till I'm blue in the face, not a peep emerges. But now, for quite some time, I've been determined in celebration of this joyous day to emit a Banzai. Indeed, I've been keenly looking forward to the arrival of this opportunity. And in the words of my neighbor in the crowd, I thought I'd have no need whatever to worry. Ever since the asthmatic whale, that's what he calls the train, wheezed, I've been standing ready with a feeling of, this is it. Thus, when the crowd whirred out, I'd expected blindly to join in. And as a matter of fact, I did force Banzai up as high as the root of my tongue. At that very second, the general went by. I saw that his skin was tanned. I saw the pepper and salt of his beard. And in the instant of that scene, the emergent Banzai lodged in my gullet. Why? How should I know? It's possible that Soseki was among the Todai students who were the first to cry Banzai back in 1889, but I like to think that he and Shiki were off somewhere watching Rakugo.